Chuy Luiano, La Migra, Immigration. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 700 stations on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on Direct TV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines also available in Spanish for any radio station to take, as over 200 are. Well, our next guest is Andrew Bacevich. He's a conservative historian. He spent 23 years serving in the U.S. Army. He also lost his son in Iraq. Andrew Bacevich writes, quote, "In joining the Army, my son was following in his father's footsteps. Before he was born, I had served in Vietnam. As military officers, we shared an ironic kinship of sorts, each of us demonstrating a peculiar knack for picking the wrong war at the wrong time." Andrew Bacevich holds both parties accountable for the Iraq War. As he writes, "To be fair, responsibility for the war's continuation now rests no less with the Democrats who control Congress than with the president and his party. After my son's death, my state senators, Edward Kennedy, John Kerry, telephoned to express their condolences. Stephen Lynch, our congressman, attended my son's wake. Kerry was present for the funeral mass. My family and I greatly appreciated such gestures. But when I suggested to each of them the necessity of ending the war, I got the brush off." Bacevich goes on to write, "To whom do Kennedy, Kerry, and Lynch listen? We know the answer: to the same people who have the ear of George W. Bush and Karl Rove, namely wealthy individuals and institutions." Andrew Bacevich has just published a new book. It's called, Bacevich has just published a new book. It's called The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism. He joins me here in the Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much for having me.
How hard was it to write this book after your son's death? This is not theoretical for you.
Well, I try not to talk about my son's death because it's a private matter, and to tell you the truth, I don't want to do anything that even looks like it might be exploiting his memory. I would say that I imagine that some of the energy that informed the writing of a book came from the emotional response to my son's death. But the content, the critique, is unrelated to that tragedy. The content of the book very much reflects my dismay at the direction of U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. There's a lot in the book that tries to hold the Bush administration accountable for recent events, but I would not for a second want to suggest that the crisis in which we find ourselves today ought to be laid simply at the foot of the Bush administration or the Republican Party, because it's been a long time coming.
What do you mean by exceptionalism?
Well, this is not an idea that's original with me. It's clear that from the founding of the Anglo-American colonies, from the time that John Winthrop made his famous sermon and declared that we shall be as a city upon a hill, a light to the world, it's clear that from the outset there's been a strong sense among Americans that we are a special people with a providential mission. In the 20th century, probably going back to roughly the time of Woodrow Wilson, certainly since the end of the Cold War, this concept of a providential mission and responsibility of the world has translated into a sense of empowerment or prerogative to determine the way the world is supposed to work, what it's supposed to look like. And also, over the last 20 years or so, an increasing willingness to use military force to cause the world to look the way we want it to look. And I think that that expression of American exceptionalism is one that's not only utterly false, but is greatly at odds with our own interests as a country.
You write, recalling how Washington saw the post-Cold War world and America's place in or atop it helps us understand why policymakers failed to anticipate, deter, or deflect the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
Well, I mean, and again, this is very much not something that one would lay at the foot of the Bush administration, but you recalled at the end of the Cold War, when history had supposedly ended, when globalization, which really was a synonym for Americanization, was thought to be sweeping the world and creating a new order, when Democrats and Republicans alike declared with great confidence that not only was the U.S. the sole superpower, but that the U.S. possessed military might such as the world had never seen. Well, an attack on Manhattan, killing 3,000 Americans, wasn't something that was supposed to happen. So the focus in the 90s, in the Clinton era, and the focus into the first 9 months or so of the Bush era was very much out there somewhere, you know, where we were going to sort out the problems of the world. Nobody was paying attention to what the possibility of actually having to defend the United States of America. So there we were, spending on defense, well, defense in quotes, defending on our military, probably as much as the rest of the world was spending on their militaries, and yet our military simply wasn't prepared to perform what ought to be its primary mission, and that is defending the people of the United States of America.
You say the Department of Defense didn't actually do defense. It was prepared. It specialized in power projection.
It still doesn't do defense. I mean, it is a remarkable thing, I think, that the reflexive response to 9/11 is, first of all, to create a new bureaucratic entity that supposedly does defend the country. That's the Department of Homeland Security, as we call it. But to continue to see the purpose of the Department of Defense, so-called, as power projection. So what has the Department of Defense been doing for the last 7 years since 9/11? Well, it's been fighting a war in where? Afghanistan, and a second one in Iraq. Now, I think you can make the case for Afghanistan, at least in terms of, you can make a case for the necessity of holding the Taliban accountable for having given sanctuary to al-Qaeda. You can't make any case for the invasion of Iraq as related to the global war on terror. And frankly, it's becoming rather difficult, I think, to make a case for the continuation of the Afghanistan war as part of the global war on terror.
Why?
Well, I mean, you identified me as a conservative, and I don't deny that label. But I think in this particular context, what conservatism means is to be realistic in understanding how the world works and being respectful of history and taking care not to overstate one's own capacity to influence events. And I think in that regard, if we look at Afghanistan today, we have to see a country that historically, at least as I understand Afghan history, has never really functioned as an integrated and coherent nation state. It's never been ruled from Kabul. It's always been ruled from in the provinces by people you might call tribal chiefs, you might call them warlords, you can call them local bosses, but authority has been widely distributed. But we are engaged in a project in which we insist that we're going to transform Afghanistan into something more or less like a modern, coherent nation state, and indeed, we insist that it has to conform to our notions of liberal democracy. Were we able to actually do that, I think it would be a wonderful thing. But 7 years or so into this project, I'm not sure we can do it. Matter of fact, I'm increasingly persuaded that we can't do it. And therefore, And I think in your news summary, you made reference to this. For somebody like Senator Obama to say, elect me, I'll win the global war on terror by sending more troops to Afghanistan, I think ought to give people pause, and frankly, ought to cause them to wonder how much change an Obama administration would make with regard to foreign policy. That's not an argument for voting for McCain by a long shot, but it suggests the narrowness of